Okay, everybody have it? Chapter 11, verse 1 of Exodus. Okay, Norman, please.
And the Eternal One said to Moses, I will bring but one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. After that he shall let you go from here.
Okay, now listen. We've had all 9 plagues so far except for the last one. Up to this point, chapter 11, beginning of second triennial cycle. What we're about to see is right after God says to Moses, I'm going to bring one more plague, he then says, I'm going to do something else to the Egyptians, which sounds like maybe that's the 10th plague. By the way, it never said, I'm going to bring 10 plagues. You could argue that there were 11 plagues. And what was if we had 9 plagues, and the 11th plague is the slaying of the firstborn, and we're now about to see the 10th plague, we're about to see, this is a tough word, the despoilation of Egypt. You know that word? By the way, it's what the Germans did to the Jews. 1936, 1937, 1938. Before they killed them, they stole all their money. This is called the despoilation. Now watch what's going to happen closely, because before we get to the 10th plague, we have like 9.5. This is the 9.5 plague. Okay? By the way, despoilation is really bad. The Egyptians said, lice, no problem. Locusts, no problem. When the locusts finally subside, we'll fry them up, dip them in chocolate. The blood, no problem. 9.5, you take our money, let them go. Let them, now we have a problem. Right? Take your money, that's a problem. Right? Okay, so watch what happens now very closely in verse 2. Okay. No.
Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you out of here one and all. Tell the people to borrow, each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers, objects of silver and gold. The Eternal disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people. Moreover, God's envoy, Moses, was much esteemed in the land of Israel, among Pharaoh's courtiers, Egypt, among Pharaoh's courtiers and among the people.
Okay, so the plague is that God is going to God's going to force the Egyptians to allow the Jews to have all their gold and silver. Everybody see that? So that's like a plague. If someone would come to you and say, listen, turn over all your money to me. No, I'm not doing that. But if God forced you to say, oh, sure, here you go. So the next day, you're not going to be so happy, right? Because you've just lost all your stuff. So that, you could argue, is the 9.5 plague. And now I want to point out something very interesting. Once that happens, if you look at verse 3 in Hebrew, Vayiten Hashem etchen ha'am b'nei Mitzrayim, and God made the people of Israel look favorable in the eyes of Egypt. Gama ish Moshe. There is another word to describe Moses here. What is the word? Also ha'ish. Not also Moses, but also ha'ish. Good. Ish means man. Why do you think the Torah would be saying that Moses here he's the first ever, he's the man. Right? He's the man. This is not the Torah saying, hey, Moshe, you're the man. Right? It's saying Moses is now seen by the Egyptian as Ha'ish, the man. Any idea why the Torah at this point would refer to Moses specifically as the man? Richard? Yeah, very good. Roberta? Very good. 2 good answers. By the way, I don't necessarily have the answer, but I think that it's probably significant. The Torah doesn't put words like this to describe someone unless there's a reason. I don't necessarily have a great reason. It's just something to think about, that at this point in the narrative, Moses, in the eyes of the Egyptians, has been elevated to a different type of role. Okay? Just something to think about. All right. Yeah, it's definitely a development. It's definitely a development. Okay, yes. Oh, yeah? Very nice.
It says Moshe twice, both in the text itself and then the last letter, 3 words.
Oh, yeah. That's right. I've heard that. Very nice, very nice. So there's 3 words there. Gama ish Moshe. Also the man Moses. If you take the last letter of all 3 of those words, it spells Moshe. So, that's advanced. Don't worry about it. Okay, let's keep going. Edith, would you mind verse 4? Okay, good enough. So what we want to point out so far is that there's something unique about the firstborn, so much so that it's not just the firstborn of Pharaoh that's going to be killed, but also all people and all animals. Firstborn of every animal. So that's unusual. I mean, at that point you'd say, well, why? Well, what? So in some classes, they might try to tell you, all right, here's why. But you can't just give an answer to that without building up to it. So we're going to come to an answer, but it's going to take a little while in order to get the right answer. So what I wanted... Oh, yeah. I do. All right. I'm about to show you. Yeah. Hold that thought.
Thought leaves male out. It just says in every firstborn in the land of Egypt.
That's his firstborn.
Yeah, okay. So here's your problem. Hebrew is a language that has male and female words. English does not. The Hebrew says Bachor. Bachor is clearly only male. Right? It can only refer to a male. Right? The Bachor. Okay. Now, I'm going to answer Mark's question, but I need to take you first to Exodus chapter 4, verse 21. So hold your spot and flip to 4:21. It's not. I didn't bring it on the sheet, but it does. The verse does exist in your book, and it's impossible to find, but it's in there. 4:21. Page 411? All right, how about that?
31, 37. 37.
Okay. Do you have it? Okay, here we go. Can you read verse 21, 22, and 23?
And the Lord said to Moses, when you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the marvels that I've put within your power. I, however, will stiffen his heart, so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son.
Okay, so this is the first time we see in the Exodus story the concept of what it means to be a firstborn, where God refers to the children of Israel, look very closely, verse 22, as Bani, Bechori, Yisrael. The people of Israel are God's firstborn son. That's why you have the male. Okay? God's firstborn son. Okay. Verse 23.
I have said to you, let my son go, that he may worship me. Yet you refuse to let him go. Now I will slay your firstborn son.
Okay. What do we learn in verse 23? What's going on here? God predicts the 10th plague. So, if God predicts the 10th plague, why doesn't God start with the 10th plague? Why do we start with blood?
He wants to eliminate all the Egyptian gods.
Exactly. He's got to eliminate all the Egyptian gods so that Pharaoh, listen to this, so that Pharaoh, the Egyptians, and the Israelites, he's got to convince them too, that there are no other gods. That the 500 some Egyptian different gods grouped into 10 different categories don't exist. That God controls all of them. So fine. But what we see here is the ultimate sign that if you don't let my people go, I'm going to do this to you in order to get my people to go, is verse 23. It's predicted. Right? When he says, I will kill your firstborn son. So what I'm showing you is there is a correlation between who Israel is and what it will cost to free them. Does that make sense? In other words, in order to get my firstborn son, I'm going to have to take your firstborn son. Only then will that convince you. Does that make sense? Yeah, I would think so. I would think so. Unless you don't have kids. Then you'd rather have your money. So, but that's a joke. Right?
Somewhat problematic, though, because earlier in the Torah, firstborns are often pushed away. They're problematic children very often.
Yeah. So, here's the thing. It's a disappointment. It's not what their parents want. The parents want their firstborn sons to be good. Listen closely. When God says to Abraham, your wife Sarah is going to have a child, Abraham says, why don't you fix up Ishmael? What do you need to give me another child? Help me with the one that I got. That's Abraham's first reaction. Isaac preferred Esau. Eventually even he said, Rebekah's right, he's no good. But they wanted the firstborn son to be good. Reuben was supposed to be the guy. But didn't work out. So then they went to Simon. But he killed a whole city. So then they went to Levi. He killed a whole city. So then they said, all right, Judah, you're not for. All right, you'll be the king.
You'll be the next judge.
Right? Because the first three we did that class a few weeks ago. Yeah. So there is, even though you're right, in Genesis the firstborn often gets messed up, it's still the ideal. And how do I know that? Because of verse 23. Israel is my firstborn. Sorry, verse 22. B'ni b'chori Yisrael. Israel is my firstborn male child. That's what it says.
God knew he was going to get there. God knew he was going
Guatemala.
to get to the head plague. And that
The
he
US.
knew that the first 9 plagues, he hardened Pharaoh's heart as an example to the Israelites that God was awesome and he was the God of all gods.
By the way, I had another class on harden the heart. It's a little trite at this point. Who hasn't been in that class, right? But, hardening the heart, Pharaoh, if he didn't harden the heart, Pharaoh could have said, all right, look, there's a plague, and then it goes away. And there's a plague, and then it goes away. I could go on all day. I could do this all day long, Pharaoh could have said. Look, all I have to do is say, all right, I'll let you go. The plague ends. So God had to harden his heart to get him to be a little more stubborn. There's a lot of... So you can write a whole book on why he hardened his heart. Yes?
I agree with you.
Right. Okay, so well, here's what you have to do. You have to look at each time that it says it. Each time it says harden the heart, and compare the Hebrew verbs. Because sometimes it says harden, kaved, and sometimes it says strengthen, chazek. And so most of the time it's chazek, and then at the end it's harden. So you have to compare the verbs and see what the difference is. But again, that's a whole nother, I have that class eventually. But yeah, that's...
You have a whole inventory of classes you've been telling us for a couple of years.
Right. Right. But I'm limited to triennial cycle B. What can I do? You know. Okay. All right, let's go on because we have a lot to get to. Now I want to show you Exodus 13, verse 1. And now it's going to get really interesting. Okay, Exodus 13, verse 1. Ken, would you mind?
The Lord spoke further to Moses, saying, consecrate to me every firstborn, man and beast. The first issue of every womb among the Israelites is mine. And Moses said to the people, remember this day on which you went free from Egypt, the house of bondage, how the Lord freed you from it with a mighty hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. You go free on this day in the month of Aviv. So when the Lord has brought you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall observe in this month the following practice. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread.
Okay, so now we're going to get into the Haggadah. You know that. So let's skip to verse 11. Or we'll skip the Haggadah and go back to the idea of the firstborn.
And when the Lord has brought you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and to your fathers, and has given it to you, you shall set apart for the Lord every first issue of the womb. Every male firstling that your cattle drop shall be the Lord's. But every firstling ass you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you must break its neck. You must redeem every firstborn male among your children.
Okay, now, so whenever you had a firstborn animal, you had to bring it to be sacrificed in the Holy Temple and give it to God. Okay? So, and just like you know what a pidyon haben is, every firstborn male has to be redeemed by a priest because it belongs to God. And if it's not redeemed, then it's holy. And if it's holy, then it can only be used for holy things, even a child. So you'd have to sit in front of the Torah your entire life and, never do anything. So you be redeemed so that you can have a normal life, and because not everything that you do is holy all day long. But I want to look very closely. Verse 12 and 13 can teach us a lot. So, Ken, could you read one more time, verse 12 and then verse 13?
You shall set apart for the Lord every first issue of the womb. Every male firstling that your cattle drop shall be the Lord's. But every firstling ass you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you must break its neck.
Okay, I prefer donkey. So, what is going on in verse 13? That every donkey, listen closely, every donkey has to be redeemed with what's called a seh. That's the name of the animal in Hebrew, like a lamb or sheep. So, and if it's not redeemed, then you have to break its neck, cut its head off. Arafato means basically to take the head off. Okay, so what I want to show you here is that a male Israelite needs to be redeemed. Male firstborn. A donkey, we learn also, needs to be redeemed with a sheep. And if not, you Hebrew word is araf. You take its head off, or you break the neck. Break the neck. Okay, that's what we have so far. I don't expect that to make any sense, but God willing, in 27 minutes, it will. All right? Now, if...
Is it a male or female?
First question...
Does it matter on the animal whether it's a male or a female?
It's male. It's male. Male firstborn. Yeah, here too. Here too. What does the donkey have to do with the firstborn? What is it about a donkey that it's a problem that it needs to be redeemed? So, if you look in, if you look on the sheet, there's one quick midrash, but then I'll show you what it says in the book of Ezekiel. There's a midrash called Psikta Zutra, Exodus 13:13, which is basically just a collection of midrash in which it says, our rabbi said, why did donkeys merit to be redeemed more than any other impure animal? What's so great? In other words, the midrash is asking, what was the role of the donkeys in the Passover story? Where do we see them? So look what it says. Because the Israelites loaded them up on their way out of Egypt, where do you think they put all the gold and silver that they stole? Well, borrowed. Good. Vayishalu. They borrowed it. So, the donkeys were helpful on their way out. So they play a role here. But Ezekiel has a different answer. Look what it says in Ezekiel. This is amazing. Now, Ezekiel is using language to compare Israel to an unfaithful wife. God is the husband. Israel, in this case, is the wife. And they're sleeping around with other gods. So look what it says. But she whored still more, remembering how in her youth she played the whore in the land of Egypt. She lusted for concubinage with them, whose members were like those of donkeys and whose organs were like those of stallions. Okay, now, that's our Bible. That's our Bible. But notice the use of the term donkeys. The members, what Ezekiel is saying here is, Egyptians are donkeys, according to Ezekiel, right? She played the whore in the land of Egypt, whose members were the donkeys. So, at least according to the prophet Ezekiel, there is something within the nature of a donkey that is very similar to Egyptians. Now, look, Pharaoh is the most stubborn guy in the Torah. That's saying a lot, by the way. Some characters in the Torah. Pharaoh is stubborn like a donkey. Okay, at least according to Ezekiel. And so, when we are saying now that you need to redeem the donkey for the lamb, or the sheep, within the same story as redeeming the firstborn, there's something going on with the donkey. I'm not quite sure what it is yet, but there's something going on with the donkey that it reminds us of Pharaoh. Now, let's go on a little more. We're going to make it, God willing, a point. Not yet. Hold on. Hold that thought. So look now at still in chapter 13, verse 14. Verse 14. Laura, would you mind? Verse 14? Thirteen, 14.
And when in time to come your son asks you, saying, what does this mean? You shall say to him, it was with a mighty hand that the Lord brought us out from Egypt.
Okay, this is one of the 4 questions in the Haggadah. This is the question of the Tam. You know the tam, the simple child? There's the good, the wicked, and then there's the tam, the simple. Then there's the one who doesn't know how to ask. This is the one that the Haggadah takes the tam, the simple child. Okay, and look at the answer, verse 15. Okay, so what we picked up just now, listen closely, this is a little tricky. So, what we picked up just now was that we have this term araf, which means to, okay? We also just saw in verse 15, when God hardens the heart of Pharaoh, he doesn't use the word chazek, which you pointed out before, or kabed, which we'll see later. He uses the word kasheh. Anyone know the modern Hebrew word kasheh? Hard. Hard. Okay? All I'm saying so far is that we have these two terms having to do with Egyptians. They're like donkeys whose heads could be chopped off, and they're stubborn. Kasheh, they're hard, they're stubborn. Clear so far? I mean, it shouldn't make any sense, but it should be clear just that one point. It's good. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. You just have to wait and see. You just have to wait and see. Yeah.
So when it says, therefore I sacrifice to the Lord every first male of the womb sacrifices, we're talking not male humans, we're talking about those are animals?
Animals.
Okay,
Animals.
and the second part is male.
Correct. Okay, now, back on the sheet, Rashi on Exodus 13:13, and every firstborn offspring of a donkey, but not the first offspring of other clean animals. This exception is the enactment of Scripture, because the firstborn of Egyptians are compared to donkeys. Right? That's what we just said. Rashi's saying it as well. He also looks at Ezekiel, and he said, how do I know that? Because of what Ezekiel said. And further reason for this exception is because they, the donkeys, were of assistance to the Israelites when they left Egypt, which we already saw. For there was not a single Israelite who did not take with him from Egypt several donkeys laden with silver and gold of Egypt. So there's a particular role for the donkeys within this story. Okay. One more thing to show you, and then maybe we'll figure out what we're learning here. If you look now, this is the last one we'll have to skip to. But if you skip with me to Exodus 33, verse 1. Something amazing. Chapter 33, verse 1. Okay. Aaron, do you have it? Would you mind reading?
Then the Lord said to Moses, set out from here, you and the people that you have brought up from the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Say, to your offspring will I give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. I would destroy you. Now then, leave off your finery, and I will consider what to do to you. So the Israelites remained stripped of the finery from Mount Horeb on.
Okay. All right. So this is now, after all of the miracles, all of the 10 plagues, all of the splitting of the Red Sea, proving that all the Egyptian gods, all 537 of them, or however many there were, don't exist. The Jewish people, don't give it away. Don't give it away. The Jewish people have now come to Mount Sinai. Moses is like 12 minutes late, and they build a golden calf. Right, so this is chapter 33, after the golden calf. So the idea was this. Before the golden calf, God's presence would go and lead the Jewish people. After the golden calf, God said, I'm not going to go with you. I'm going to send an angel to lead you, because if I was there, I'd kill you. Right. Right. I don't know if you've ever done this. Like you said, you go tell him, because if I have to go tell him, I'm going to tear his head off. Right. I don't know if you've ever had that moment in your life. Maybe with your kids. Maybe not. Maybe they've had it with you. That's the situation. And so what God says is, tell the people that they're stiff-necked. So everybody knows, we're pointing out that Pharaoh is so stubborn. And Pharaoh never gets the message. And Pharaoh's had 1 plague and 2 plagues and 10 plagues. And even then, even after the 10th plague and his firstborn son is killed, he still sends his army out to kill the Israelites. And then they're all destroyed. He's the most stubborn person. And the Jews saw his stubbornness, and God said, don't be like Pharaoh. Don't be like the donkeys, who are kasheh, they're hard, and araf. It's like their neck is broken. They're so stubborn. So if you look in verse 3 and 5, some of you have already pointed this out. How do you say stiff-necked in Hebrew? Kasher aref is stiff-necked. I told you. I told you. So you see why you have to have the build-up? Right. So what does it mean? Okay, we see it's very cool, but what does it mean? It means this. The Egyptians, according to Ezekiel and everything that we know, are the donkeys. They're the ones who carry our gold and silver on the way out, because they're being punished for being so stubborn. They're the worst. We've taught them everything, and they haven't figured it out about God, about the reality of God. The whole story of the plagues is to teach them about the reality of God. And now you Jews, remember I said the plagues were meant to convince Pharaoh, and to convince the Egyptians, and to convince the Jews, the Israelites. You were meant to be convinced too. And after all of that, you came to Mount Sinai, and you did the same thing as the Egyptians. You became Kashay Oref. And the only reason we know about the Oref is because the donkey needs to be redeemed. And so we learn that word Oref. Right? So we put all that together. And what God's saying is, listen to how amazing this is. Here's the order that we have so far. It won't make any sense until we get to this forno, but here's the order that we have so far. The beginning of Exodus, chapter 4. Israel is my firstborn male child. Let them go, or I will take your firstborn male child. Right? So now, we're also saying, metaphorically, you are a bunch of donkeys that need to be put out of your misery and redeemed for sheep. The Jews are supposed to be my sheep, not my donkeys. But now my sheep are becoming donkeys just like you. That's a real problem. That's the stiff-necked. Okay? Now, that's what we have so far. There's another layer. But that's what we have so far. Is it clear so far? Okay, all right, so I'm even confused myself a little bit, but what? Okay, all right. All right, so now let's look at the last layer, which we have to go back to chapter 13. We were already there, so it's not like you've never been here. But chapter 13, verse 13. Okay, chapter 13, verse 13. Okay, everybody have it? Okay. Jay, would you mind reading? Could you read verse 13, verses 14, 13, 14, and 15? Yes.
But every firstling ass you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you must break its neck. And you must redeem every firstborn male among your children. And when, in time to come, your son asks you, saying, what does this mean? You shall tell him it was with a mighty hand that the Lord brought you out of Egypt, us out of Egypt, the house of bondage. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord slew every firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstborn of both man and beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord every first male issue of the womb, so redeem every firstborn among my sons.
Okay, does anyone see a problem with verse 14? The answer? So you have the... No wonder this kid's so simple. He gets ridiculous answers. Why do we have to redeem donkeys with sheep? Oh, yeah, because God took us out with an outstretched hand. So that's one of those things where you're like, oh, wait, what? It doesn't answer the question. It doesn't answer. What does sheep and donkeys have to do with God taking us out with an outstretched hand? Okay, so now we can build another layer. Once we realize that this is not a great answer, seemingly, we have to ask ourselves, well, it is a good answer, but why is it that it's not so clear? So, what do we have on a very basic level? If you think about Pesach and the Seder, the point of the Seder is to read the Haggadah. Haggadah means the telling of the story. The point of the Seder is to tell the story to the next generation. Right? That's why you have the Afikomen, to keep them awake, so they have something to look forward to. Literally, that's the only reason. All right, so I'm only using masculine terms because that's what the verse says. When your son will ask you tomorrow, you shall say to him. However, that means everybody. Because remember, who's the son? Who's the firstborn son? All of Israel. So this means all Jews. It just happens to be in masculine terms. That's a whole different class. The other rabbis teach that class, the gender ones. So I don't know. I mean, they're fine. You can take them. It's not for me. All right. The father asks the son. I'm sorry. The son asks the father, and then the father answers with an answer that doesn't seem to necessarily make sense, because God took us out with an outstretched arm. Okay. So now look at Sforno on the sheet. 16th century Italy, great Torah commentator, on verse 14. He says, Mi Mitzrayim, meaning from Egypt. Due to the urgency with which the Egyptians wanted to get rid of us, we left Egypt traveling in coaches. Just as the family of Jacob, had arrived in Egypt hundreds of years ago in coaches supplied by Pharaoh himself. The Torah usually translate that, by the way, as wagons, but here it says coaches. But the coaches materialized miraculously, as well as the many donkeys needed to transport the newfound riches of the people. So in other words, there's this idea that, really, were there that many donkeys around? I mean, where'd all the donkeys come from that million Israelites, all of a sudden, each one had their own donkeys to take? There was a lot of silver and gold in Egypt, and they took it all. If it wasn't nailed down, even if it was nailed down, they took it. Seeing that the donkeys had therefore had a constructive part of the redemption of the Israelites, this is reflected in their not being treated like all the other impure beasts. The degree of minor sanctity according to the firstborn donkey may be redeemed in exchange for a pure animal so that the donkeys can then be used in a regular way. All right, that's some halachic ideas. We don't need to get caught up in the halacha right now. But look at the next forno on verse 15. Seeing that Pharaoh had put so many obstacles in the path of our eventual liberation, he is himself compared to a donkey, as we know from Ezekiel 23:20, which we looked at. The prophet describing the flesh of the Egyptians is similar to donkeys. Pharaoh could have easily redeemed himself by releasing the Israelites, i.e. the Israelites are compared to the lamb, the set. As a result of failing to do so, God chose to kill his firstborn instead. So what Sforno just said, which I will now explain, is tremendously profound. Tremendously profound. And from here we can learn a very interesting lesson. Okay? What he said is, well, we saw in chapter 4 that God told Moses that you're going to say to Pharaoh, let my people go, or I will kill your firstborn. Now, we know that Pharaoh's not going to let our people go because we've read the story. And we know the story. It's the one story that Jews actually know because of the Seder every year. So, we know the story. But Pharaoh is given the chance to release the firstborn. If he would have done so, he would have redeemed his own firstborn. So we Jews, listen closely, we Jews have to redeem our firstborn. Why do we have to redeem our firstborn? So that we're not like Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh had a chance to redeem his firstborn and said, no, I'm not going to do it. You see that? I'll say it one more time. It's a little confusing. We Jews have a mitzvah. It's called Pidyon Haben. We just saw it. You have to redeem your firstborn son. You have to, in the times of the Holy Temple, any firstborn animal that you had, you have to give to God. The firstborn of everything goes to God. Because when we do give our firstborn to God, we show that we're different than Pharaoh. When did Pharaoh have a chance to redeem his firstborn? When he was told, let the Jewish people go, or I will slay your firstborn. So, if he would have let the Jewish people go, the 10th plague wouldn't have happened. He would have redeemed his firstborn. So, in order... The one time that God told us, hey, you guys are acting like Pharaoh. You guys are doing just what I've tried to tell you not to do. Because you worship the golden calf, and you went away from me, and you worshipped idols just like Pharaoh, and you were kshe oref. And that's what Pharaoh is. You're kshe oref. Don't be like that. So we redeem the firstborn to remind us not to be. But here's what this form, does that make sense so far? But here's the message from it. Here's what it's really saying. And I think, in many ways, this is the essence of what it means to be Jewish. In many ways. Not every way, but in many ways, this is the essence of what it means to be Jewish. And before I tell you what it is, the essence to be Jewish, you have to understand that all the evil empires that have tried to destroy us are gone. As I mentioned last night in a sermon that most of you didn't hear. I mean, it existed. It was there. It was there for the taking. But the idea was, think about 1917. You were there, right? It's right. You can watch it online. Go to my Facebook page. There it is. Or or the Beth Am app, or the Beth Am website. 1917, the Balfour Declaration. England declares that Israel should have a homeland in the land of Israel. Her Majesty's government looks favorably upon it, right? 1917 also, the Soviet Union is formed. So if you think about it, 1917, if you were a betting man or woman in 1917 and someone said, all right, you got the Soviet Union coming off a pretty big win, World War I, tremendous natural resources, monster army, a lot of people, huge territory, not a lot of enemies surrounding it that could compete with it. So you got them. Or Israel, everybody hates them. There's only about 300,000 of them there. They have no army to speak of. They have a tiny piece of land. They have no natural resources, almost nothing going for it. Nobody really likes them. No allies. Enemies surrounding it on every border. In 100 years, who do you think is going to be better off, the Soviet Union or the State of Israel? You'd probably put your money on the Soviet Union. You get to 2017, 100 years later, Soviet Union is long gone, and Israel is considered the most innovative country in the world by the president of Google and Alibaba, Jack Ma. They both said Israel, most innovative country in the world, doing pretty well. It's hard. You would have lost a lot of money if you made that bet. So, when you consider that, and you consider all of this, here's what we learn. Here's the essence of what it means to be Jewish that Pharaoh couldn't understand. You ready? Pharaoh had the opportunity to redeem his firstborn, and he didn't do it. The Jews have the opportunity to redeem their firstborn, and it's part of halakha. You have to do it. And so we do it. We still do it, even though there's no holy temple. So what it means is Jews understand that if you want to survive, your whole essence of your being means that you have to sacrifice for your children. That's the whole story. If you don't sacrifice for your children, if you don't take of what you have to give to your children, you'll never survive. And so the secret to Jewish survival is that each generation has to be willing to give of itself and sacrifice everything possible in order that the next generation will succeed. And if you think about it, if that is your formula for success, how could you possibly fail? That's the essence of what it means to be Jewish. And that's why the 10th plague was killing of the firstborn. And that's why we still redeem the firstborn. And that's why the lamb, the sheep, which is the Jews, has to be redeemed to replace the donkey, which is Egypt. We're not saying so much, kill the sheep, take the sheep and kill the donkey. What we're saying is, wipe out the idea of you're not willing to redeem your firstborn for the idea of sacrifice everything that you have in order to redeem the firstborn. That's the whole story here. Okay, Shabbat Shalom.